Tanners worked with rotting flesh and dog urine and died from the fumes. They stood ankle-deep in filth, men with stained hands and hollow eyes. The scent clung to them like a curse. Not even death offered relief from the stench. These were the tanners, forgotten laborers who lived and died by rot, piss, and hide. Long before leather became a fashion statement, it was survival. Armor, boots, saddles, and scrolls, leather was civilization's backbone. But behind its utility was an ancient industry soaked in horror. Tanning wasn't just unpleasant, it was lethal. In medieval Europe, the tanner's job was considered so vile, they were often forced to live on the outskirts of towns, downstream, far from temples and markets. They weren't welcome in polite society. Why? Because their work began with corpses, dead animals, sometimes newly slaughtered, sometimes long rotted. Their flesh, often crawling with maggots, was skinned by hand. Tanners would work quickly, not for efficiency, but because the stench could make a man vomit if he stood still too long. Once the hide was removed, it was soaked in water, often the same water others wouldn't even wash rags in. The goal was to loosen flesh, fat, and hair. But the next step was worse. To remove remaining tissue, tanners used urine, human urine, collected from pots outside homes, sold in barrels by the poor. The ammonia in the urine broke down fats and helped cleanse the skin, but it also burned the eyes, nose, and lungs. Every breath was a chemical attack. The longer a tanner worked, the more their skin cracked, bled, and burned. But they continued. There was no alternative. It was a profession often passed down through generations, like a curse written in blood and bile. But the horror didn't stop at urine. To soften the hides, tanners used a slurry made of dog feces. It wasn't a secret. Buckets of dog dung were collected daily, fermenting in the heat. Tanners would stomp the hides barefoot in this mix, kneading the mess into the leather. Children, too, were employed in these pits, some as young as 7. With no masks, no gloves, and no mercy, they inhaled toxic gases for hours. Hydrogen sulfide, released by decomposing organic matter, attacked their respiratory systems. Exposure led to chronic coughing, collapsed lungs, and, in many cases, death. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, painfully, as the lungs hardened and the blood turned septic. Then came the final stage, treatment with tannins. Extracted from oak bark or gall nuts, these acidic compounds helped preserve the leather. But the process required days, sometimes weeks of soaking, often in stagnant vats, swarming with bacteria. Cuts on hands became infected. Fungal diseases flourished under fingernails. Insects were constant companions. Tanners often carried the smell of rot so thoroughly in their clothes that even their families would avoid them. They were known by scent before sight. Churches sometimes refused to bury them in consecrated ground. Their work was seen as unholy. Their touch was said to carry disease, and in many ways it did. Plague and cholera outbreaks were often traced back to polluted tanneries. Rats fed on the flesh remnants, flies bred in the excrement vats, and rivers downstream ran dark and toxic. Still, cities needed leather. Kings, merchants, travelers, everyone required it. So tanners remained a necessary evil. And despite their low status, they wielded a dark kind of power. If they stopped working, boots weren't made, horses weren't saddled, scrolls weren't written. They were ghosts among the living, essential but invisible. In 16th century London, entire quarters were devoted to tanning. Bermondsey, for instance, reeked of death for miles. Travelers noted the clouds seemed to change color over it. Locals claimed birds avoided the skies there. And still, young boys were apprenticed into the trade, their fates sealed. By the 18th century, some improvements arrived. Industrial processes replaced bare feet and hands, but even then, the fumes remained. Workers in leather factories still collapsed, still coughed blood, still died before 40. The death toll was simply absorbed into the cost of industry. In some parts of the world, the old ways never ended. Even in the 20th century, traditional tanneries in Morocco, India, and Ethiopia operated in much the same way: open pits, animal dung, and urine-soaked hides. Tourists would visit, holding mint leaves to their noses, smiling for photographs. But beneath the surface, men still died young, still lost fingers, still buried brothers who once stood in the same pit beside them. The tanner's legacy isn't romantic. It's not gilded in gold or etched in stone. It's leather, and leather remembers. Every supple glove, every gleaming belt, every ancient scroll etched on calfskin parchment carried the story of someone who gave their lungs, their skin, their life to transform decay into durability. No perfume can erase that. So next time you run your fingers across a smooth leather seat or admire the binding of an old book, pause. Beneath the finish lies blood and bile. Behind the polish, ghosts still breathe. And somewhere in the pages of forgotten history, the tanner still stands, barefoot in excrement, breathing poison, making beauty from rot. Lead miners were blinded, crushed, or poisoned by the job. In the shadows beneath the earth, where light never touched stone and silence echoed louder than thunder, thousands of men descended every day to mine lead, a metal that would make them sick, blind, and sometimes dead. These were not men chasing riches. These were fathers and sons whose only other option was starvation. What they walked into each day was a death sentence that paid just enough to keep their families alive. The lead mines of England, especially in places like Derbyshire and Cornwall, became a trap for the working poor from the 16th century onward. Children as young as 6 were employed. Their small bodies made it easier to crawl through the tightest seams in the rock. Their wages, mere pennies, fed entire families. And the deeper they dug, the darker their world became, not just from lack of sunlight, but from the invisible poison that filled their lungs. Lead dust was insidious. You couldn't see it, couldn't smell it. It coated their skin, clung to their clothes, and settled deep into their chests. Over time, the miners developed what was called miner's rot, a cruel combination of chronic bronchitis, collapsed lungs, and lead poisoning. Their gums would turn blue. Their teeth fell out. Their joints swelled. Their hands trembled so violently that many could no longer hold their tools, even if they wanted to. But there were always more workers willing to descend. No masks, no ventilation, no rights. Miners often worked for 12 to 16 hours a day, swinging picks and hauling carts in spaces so tight they had to lie on their backs just to chip away at the rock above them. And all around them, death waited. The tunnels were known to collapse without warning. One crack in a beam, one shifting stone, and the ceiling came down like a hammer. Men were crushed to death mid-swing. Others suffocated slowly beneath the rubble. Their bodies never recovered. If the collapse didn't get you, the fumes might. Candlelight flickered across damp walls, the only illumination in a world that breathed poison. Methane and other gases built up in stagnant pockets. When exposed to flame, they ignited in explosions that tore through the tunnels. Survivors spoke of screams echoing through the dark, of fire that rolled like waves down stone corridors. And yet, every day, they went back in. Lead poisoning wasn't limited to the lungs. It infected the brain. Miners developed what the locals called madness of the pit. They forgot names, became disoriented, violent. Some walked into mine shafts and never returned. Others had seizures or hallucinations that left them broken long before death arrived. And the worst part was, no one cared. The mine owners knew the risks, but the profit was too good. The empire ran on lead. It built plumbing, stained glass, bullets, paints. And behind all of it was the silent, coughing army beneath the ground. Women and children didn't escape the horror. Wives of miners often washed their husbands' clothes. rinsing out the lead dust with bare hands in cold, open basins. They became poisoned by proxy. Children who never set foot in a mine suffered from neurological disorders, miscarriages, and stunted growth. The entire community bore the weight of the mines, generation after generation. In some regions, like the Peak District, lead mining shaped every aspect of life. The miners lived in tiny stone cottages just yards from the pits. They drank water laced with lead. They ate vegetables grown in contaminated soil. They died young, many before the age of 40. Their gravestones are still found today, worn down by time, but etched with short lives and long suffering. There were no unions, no regulations, no protection. By the 18th century, some reformers began to speak out, but even then, they were ignored. The miners themselves rarely protested. What else could they do? If they stopped, their families starved. If they worked, they died slowly. Survival wasn't about choice, it was about necessity, and the mines knew it. Even the tools betrayed them. Rusty, dull picks and rotting carts made every shift more dangerous. Some used makeshift respirators made of cloth soaked in water or vinegar, believing it might stop the poison. It didn't. The lead still found a way in, through skin, through breath, through every crack in their defenses. Doctors eventually came to recognize the symptoms: abdominal pain, anemia, paralysis, mental deterioration. But for the miners, this knowledge offered no relief. Medical treatment was either too expensive or completely unavailable. Some were sent to asylums. Others simply disappeared from their villages, too sick to work, too poor to matter. And still, the industry thrived. By the 19th century, technological advancements made the extraction of lead even faster, but faster meant more risk. Water pumps failed, tunnels flooded, explosives collapsed entire networks. There are stories of entire shifts never returning, lost in cave-ins so deep that not even their screams made it back to the surface. The irony is bitter. Lead, which the ancient Romans once called the father of all metals, became a curse in modern hands. A material that promised strength delivered only suffering to those who brought it to light. The same substance that made cities shine in leaded glass and sound with church bells also dimmed the minds and eyes of the men who mined it. They weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were desperate, caught in a system that weighed their lives against ounces of metal. And when they died, the earth kept their bones and whispered their stories to no one. Only now do we remember. Only now do we tell what the mines erased. This is the legacy of lead mining, not the wealth, not the empire, but the silence that followed every breath of dust. And the men who took that breath anyway. Chimney sweeps were often children, and died from soot-laden lungs. In the shadows of the Industrial Revolution, amid the clamor of progress and prosperity, there existed a haunting reality that history often whispers about but seldom confronts: the lives of child chimney sweeps. These were not tales of Dickensian exaggeration, but brutal, flesh-and-bone truths carved into the soot-blackened alleys of 18th and 19th century Britain. Boys, some barely 6 years old, were forced into labyrinths of brick and smoke, sent crawling through narrow chimney flues barely wider than their shoulders, their childhoods consumed by ash. These children were known as climbing boys, a term that barely masks the horror of their existence. Many were orphans, paupers, or sold by desperate parents to master sweeps for a few shillings and a promise of food. But what awaited them was not nourishment or shelter. It was a life of suffocating labor, scarred skin, and lungs filled with carcinogenic soot. These flues, often only 9 inches wide, required the smallest, thinnest bodies. That meant boys as young as 4 or 5 were prized. They were woken before dawn, fed scraps, and forced up cold, soot-choked chimneys with nothing but scraped knees and a stiff bristled brush strapped to their backs. They climbed by pressing their knees, elbows, and backs against the inner walls, inching their way up through darkness. They couldn't see. They could barely breathe. The soot clung to their wet skin, scarring it. Their spines twisted unnaturally over time. Many developed what became known as chimney sweep's carcinoma, the first documented occupational cancer, where malignant sores would form on their scrotums due to prolonged soot exposure. But the cruel irony was that even this slow-growing cancer was often a mercy compared to the other horrors they faced. Children would become lodged in chimneys, trapped in the tight flues. If they didn't suffocate, they starved, entombed in brick as their masters moved on to find a new child. Others fell from dizzying heights to their deaths, yet the work continued. The demand for clean chimneys in coal-burning England was insatiable, driven by a society more focused on comfort and industrial efficiency than the lives sacrificed to sustain it. Master sweeps would use threats, hunger, and even fire, lighting straw beneath the chimney opening, to force reluctant children upward. The pain of burns was meant to be motivation, and in many cases, it worked. A boy named Valentine Gray was found dead in a barn in 1822, his body riddled with bruises. His master, accused of beating him, claimed the child had refused to climb. Valentine was 10. Society knew. Lawmakers knew. Writers and reformers documented these atrocities, but change was sluggish. It took until 1788 for the first Chimney Sweepers Act to be passed in Britain, mandating that sweeps be at least 8 years old. But the law lacked enforcement. In reality, it did nothing. Children were still crawling through chimneys. The 1834 Act attempted to raise the age to 14, but again, without policing or punishment, the law remained a ghost. It wasn't until 1875 that Parliament finally passed a law with real enforcement, banning child labor in the chimney-sweeping trade. That's nearly a century of known abuse before any meaningful intervention. By then, the damage had been done. Thousands of children had died. Thousands more had grown into adulthood with permanent disabilities, twisted limbs, stunted growth, chronic lung disease, and emotional scars that would never heal. Their labor built warm parlors, kept hearths burning, and made city life bearable for the upper classes. But no one saw them. They were hidden in the walls, ghosts inside the chimneys they cleaned, heard only when their screams echoed out from flues too tight to escape. The story of child chimney sweeps is not just a tale of labor abuse. It is a study in societal blindness, a reminder of what happens when comfort outweighs conscience. These children were not workers. They were sacrifices, offered to a god of industrialization, progress, and class divide. Their names rarely recorded, their lives rarely mourned, just soot, just ash. Forgotten in the chimneys they died to clean. And yet, remnants of them remain. Some flues in ancient houses still bear the scratch marks of their desperate climbs. Historians have found bones inside old chimneys, skeletal remains curled into fetal positions, boys who never came down. Their suffering, though buried under centuries of soot and denial, is a black stain on the canvas of progress. It is vital to speak their stories, not to evoke pity, but to bear witness, to understand how easily societies can overlook horror when it is hidden behind brick, behind class, behind the veil of convenience. The chimney sweeps did not die for nothing, unless we allow their memory to disappear again into the smoke. This history is real, it is visceral, and it serves as a chilling mirror to every modern system where the vulnerable are used, discarded, and erased. Let the story of the chimney sweeps be more than a dark footnote. Let it be a warning. Gong farmers. Cleaned human waste. In the dead of night. In the dead of night, long after candles flickered out and streets fell silent, a hidden labor force emerged beneath the medieval cities of England. They were not spoken of in polite company, not invited to guild feasts or civic meetings. Yet the work they did was essential, revolting, and unimaginably dangerous. They were the gong farmers, men tasked with the removal of human excrement from cesspits, latrines, and public privies. Their job was to clean what society chose to ignore, And they did so under moonlight, when the stench wouldn't travel as far and the shame could remain unseen. The term gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go, a euphemism for human waste. These men, paid by municipalities or wealthy households, descended into the filth, often chest deep, armed with long-handled shovels and coarse baskets. The cesspits they entered were not shallow bowls, but deep, festering chambers dug beneath homes, inns, and public houses. Some were several feet across and even deeper in descent. As waste accumulated over months, sometimes years, it fermented, releasing methane and noxious gases. The dangers were not just from the suffocating stench. The air itself could ignite with a spark, and the floor beneath the sludge was often unstable, leading to drownings, suffocations, and disappearances. Protective gear was virtually non-existent. Gong farmers typically wore thick, layered clothing, more for the cold of night than for sanitation, and cloths over their faces to combat the overwhelming odor. But these barriers were weak. Their skin absorbed the rot. Their lungs inhaled particles of decay. Many suffered chronic respiratory infections, skin disorders, and permanent loss of smell. The work aged them, hardened them, and marked them socially. Even when clean, the stigma remained. Children would chant insults. Women would cross streets to avoid them. Priests hesitated to bless them. They were tolerated only because they were necessary. The job, however, came with surprising perks. In a society of rigid hierarchies and mass poverty, gong farmers earned more than many laborers. In London, records from the 16th century suggest a gong farmer could earn up to 6 pence a night, more than what some skilled workers made in a full day. But it was not consistent work, and it came with risk, not just to health, but to life. Cesspits sometimes collapsed. Others were so filled that extracting waste required improvisation, climbing walls slick with slime, using ropes and pulleys that often failed. If a gong farmer fell in and couldn't be reached quickly, they suffocated, died in darkness, swallowed by humanity's waste. The waste they extracted was carted away before dawn, often to the outskirts of towns or to designated dumping grounds. In rural areas, it was sold as fertilizer, known as night soil, and spread over fields. This practice continued for centuries, despite its links to outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. Public health was barely understood, and municipal efforts to deal with human waste were always a step behind population growth. In many towns, the cesspits overflowed before anyone called a gong farmer. By then, the damage was already festering, beneath streets, beneath homes, and in the air people breathed. In larger cities, such as London or York, the volume of waste overwhelmed the infrastructure. Gong farmers worked in teams, sometimes under the supervision of officials tasked with maintaining sanitation. But these officials often turned blind eyes to failing conditions. Some cesspits were shared by entire tenement blocks. A single pit could serve hundreds. And when it failed, the consequences seeped upward. Walls collapsed, floors rotted, and foul air infected sleeping children. The job was not static either. Over time, as urban populations swelled, the sheer scale of waste made traditional cesspits obsolete. In the 17th century, rudimentary sewers and drainage channels began to appear, but these too needed cleaning. So the gong farmers adapted. They became sewer workers, drain uncloggers, or nightmen. The name changed, but the filth remained. Society's relationship to them was paradoxical. On one hand, they were despised, seen as dirty, unclean, unfit for regular interaction. On the other, they were vital. Without them, the city would literally drown in its own waste. Their work prevented disease, preserved homes, protected drinking water, though not always effectively. Still, few thanked them. Their existence was largely ignored until needed, like a ghost force summoned only when the rot rose too high. In some cities, regulations were passed to control when and how they worked. They could only operate during certain hours, could not dump waste near wells, could not walk openly through the streets in daytime with their tools or carts. The public did not want reminders of what lay beneath their feet. But despite the rules, the danger, and the disdain, they kept showing up, night after night, because someone had to. Someone had to lower themselves into the filth. Someone had to breathe in what others flushed away. Someone had to shovel it into baskets, hoist it up through narrow shafts, load it into carts, and disappear before sunrise. Their stories rarely made it into history books. Their names were almost never recorded. Yet the cities we romanticize, the London of Shakespeare, the medieval towns of Europe, could not have functioned without them. Beneath the cobblestones and candlelight, under the laughter of taverns and the hymns of cathedrals, the gong farmers worked, in darkness, in silence, in muck, and sometimes they died in it. One slip, one gas pocket, one unstable wall. That was all it took. A man could vanish under the waste of others and never be seen again. No funeral, no monument, just a foul stench that lingered for days and a job posting to replace him. This was the cost of cleanliness before plumbing, before sanitation science, before health departments and underground sewage systems. It was paid in full by the gong farmers, who waited where no one else would, not for glory, not even for respect, but because cities couldn't survive without them. And now, centuries later, their labor is largely forgotten, their stories untold. Yet every flush, every drain, every pipe we take for granted traces its ancestry back to them. To the men who cleaned the waste of civilization with nothing but a shovel, a lantern, and a stomach strong enough to endure the unendurable. They were the silent guardians of human waste, and they walked, no, they crawled, through history beneath our feet. Fullers beat wool in human urine for hours, until they collapsed. They were called fullers. And though history rarely remembers them, the fabric of medieval life, literally, passed through their broken hands. Long before automated looms and chemical detergents, wool needed to be processed in the most grueling, nauseating way imaginable, by stomping it for hours in human urine. Fulling was essential. Raw wool, fresh off the sheep, was greasy, matted, and full of natural oils like lanolin. These oils had to be removed for the wool to be spun and woven properly. But there were no gentle soaps in the medieval world. What they had was urine. And not just any urine, fresh human urine, collected in pots, barrels, and chamber pots from households and outhouses across towns and cities. It was known as lant, and it was rich in ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent. Fullers took this urine and poured it into large vats or stone troughs. Then they added the wool, and then they climbed in barefoot. For hours, sometimes for entire days, fullers would stomp on the wet, reeking wool. Step after step, knee-deep or even waist-deep in liquid human waste, churning, pressing, beating the cloth with their own body weight. There was no music, no rest, just the sloshing of urine and the burning in their lungs as ammonia filled the air. The fumes were not just unpleasant, they were dangerous. Ammonia gas, in enclosed or poorly ventilated spaces, damages the mucous membranes and lungs. Prolonged exposure causes coughing fits, dizziness, even hallucinations. Fullers frequently vomited on the job or collapsed mid-shift, gasping for breath. Some suffered permanent damage to their respiratory systems. But it didn't matter. The wool had to be processed. Clothing had to be made. Society needed fullers, just not enough to protect them. The job also required tremendous physical strength. The repeated stomping wasn't light shuffling, it was hard labor. Imagine dancing in place for hours in thick, heavy, saturated cloth. Each step resisted your legs. The wet wool tangled around your ankles. You pushed down not only with your weight, but often with wooden paddles or your fists, kneading the fabric deeper into the foul-smelling slurry. Muscles tore, joints inflamed. Many fullers developed permanent back problems before the age of 30. Their knees buckled over time. Some ended up crippled, too poor to afford care, too broken to work. But even that wasn't the end. Once the urine treatment was finished, the cloth had to be washed and dried. In some regions, this was done in freezing rivers. Imagine it, soaked in sweat and piss. The fuller now had to wade waist-deep into icy waters to rinse the fabric. There were no waterproof gloves, no protective boots, just cracked skin, infections waiting to happen, and bitter cold that drove many into early graves. The stench followed them everywhere. Fullers could be identified by smell alone. Their clothes reeked of ammonia. Their skin was raw. Children crossed the street to avoid them. They were essential and ostracized, praised by the nobility for enabling the luxurious wool trade, but spat on by neighbors who refused to sit beside them at church. In fact, many fullers were forced to live outside of town boundaries, in the same way as tanners and executioners. Medieval society relied on their work, but did not want to see it or smell it. Some towns even had ordinances forcing fullers to carry out their tasks downstream, so the stink wouldn't foul the air of the elite. And yet, there was a strange dignity in it. Fullers formed tight-knit communities. They passed their skills from father to son. Some earned decent wages, especially in cloth-producing hubs like Flanders or northern Italy. In cities where the wool trade thrived, fullers' guilds rose to power. But even then, the conditions barely changed. Ammonia was still the best degreasing agent available. Human urine remained in high demand. So widespread was the practice that urine became a commodity. In some regions, residents were paid to contribute to the fuller's collection barrel. A household's morning offering wasn't just a chore. It was an act of civic participation in the local textile economy. Over time, technology began to shift. By the late Renaissance, fuller's earth, an absorbent clay, began to replace urine in some regions, but the transition was slow. In many parts of Europe, especially rural towns, urine-based fulling continued well into the 18th century. The legacy of the fuller is both forgotten and embedded in the very clothes that built civilizations. The luxurious robes of kings, the rich tapestries of cathedrals, the heavy wool cloaks worn by soldiers and peasants alike, all of them were softened, purified, and strengthened in the urine-drenched troughs of a fuller's workshop. And still, we barely speak their name. Behind every smooth garment of medieval Europe was a man or woman who collapsed into ammonia fumes, who gave their lungs and limbs to the textile machine, whose fingerprints disappeared under cloth and caustic liquid. They died coughing, limping, and unseen, but their work endured. So next time you read of noble feasts or royal robes, remember the fuller, not a knight, not a king, but someone buried up to their knees in human waste so the rest of the world could feel comfort on their skin. Theirs was a history written not in ink, but in sweat, urine, and pain. Plague doctors weren't doctors, and they died first. They walked the streets like omens, shrouded in black, faceless, behind glassy eyes, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Wherever they appeared, the whispers followed. Some believed they were harbingers of death. Others believed they were death itself. But the truth? Most plague doctors weren't even doctors, and despite their ominous image, they were often the first to die. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it broke the idea of safety. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague swept through Europe like a storm of rot, killing an estimated 25 to 50 million people, over a third of the continent's population. People died faster than they could be buried. Priests refused last rites. Families abandoned their own children. The world needed help, but real physicians, those few who existed, had no answers. Their methods were based on astrology, humorism, and divine punishment, bloodletting, leeches, amulets. Nothing worked. Worse, most trained physicians fled when the plague arrived, so cities turned to anyone willing to enter the infected zones. Enter the plague doctor. He wore a wide-brimmed hat to signify authority, a long black robe coated in wax or animal fat, meant to repel disease, gloves, boots, and a wooden cane to poke the sick without touching them. And most memorably, a mask with a long, curved beak filled with aromatic herbs and dried flowers. To modern eyes, the costume looks like a Halloween parody. But in the 17th century, it was deadly serious. The beak wasn't decoration, it was desperation. Based on the miasma theory, which believed that illness spread through bad air, the herbs were intended to cleanse the breath and keep infection at bay. But miasma was a myth. The real enemy was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats. And the suit? It offered no real protection. Worse still, the people wearing it were often dangerously underqualified. Contrary to the title, plague doctors were rarely trained professionals. Many were failed medical students, barbers, grave diggers, or even criminals offered freedom in exchange for service. Some were chosen by lottery. Some were volunteers with nothing left to lose. They weren't expected to cure the sick. Their job was administrative: record deaths, count corpses, witness wills, estimate property for tax collection. But their mere presence became symbolic. When the plague doctor came to your door, it meant your street, your home, your family had been marked. The cane they carried was not just for examining the sick from a distance. It was used to keep crowds away, to lift the covers of corpses, to draw curtains across infected rooms, or to point at someone for removal. A wave of the cane could mean exile or burial. Many plague doctors died within days of arriving in infected cities. Their suits, stitched by hand, were neither sealed nor disinfected. The robes soaked up infected fluids. The mask's interior grew moldy and toxic. Hydrogen sulfide and ammonia from corpses filled their lungs. They walked from plague houses to marketplaces, unknowingly spreading death like smoke from a fire. They were not healers. They were contaminated messengers, drawn in, chewed up, and forgotten. One of the earliest known plague doctors was Guy de Chauliac, a French physician who actually stayed behind during the Black Death in Avignon. He documented the symptoms in brutal detail: high fever, vomiting of blood, painful swellings, buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. People died in agony within days. His writings influenced plague care for centuries, but most doctors after him lacked his courage or clarity. By the 17th century, the plague doctor costume had become standardized, largely thanks to Charles Delorme, who designed the beaked mask in 1619 for French and Italian doctors. It looked scientific. It felt protective. But the false confidence it inspired cost lives. People trusted the suit more than the science, and governments sent these men into quarantined zones with no backup, no knowledge, and no hope. In cities like Venice and Marseille, plague doctors were given contracts. Some were paid handsomely, others were offered shelter, and a promise that their families would be cared for if they died. They were sometimes imprisoned in their quarters to prevent them from fleeing. Their names were rarely recorded. If they survived, they carried lifelong injuries, blindness, lung disease, neurological damage. The people they visited often didn't want their help. Some threw stones, others barricaded their doors. A few, delirious from fever, attacked the masked figures, believing them to be demons or angels of death. And sometimes, in plague-addled madness, communities blamed the doctors for spreading the disease. Riots broke out, suits were burned, men were murdered in the very streets they were hired to save. There were exceptions: doctors who documented symptoms, conducted autopsies, attempted rudimentary quarantines. But without germ theory, antibiotics, or even microscopes, they were navigating a burning forest with blindfolds on. As the centuries passed and the final waves of plague dwindled, the image of the beaked plague doctor became legend, etched into woodcuts, painted in frescoes, immortalized in carnival costumes. It became a Gothic symbol, a theatrical ghost of real suffering. Today, it's worn in masquerades, depicted in horror films, sold as Halloween masks. But behind the mask was no monster, only desperation, only fear. A man with no real training, no tools, and often no chance. He was sent into a battlefield with no armor and no weapon, because someone had to, and that someone died first. The next time you see the image, the long beak, the blank eyes, the cane, don't laugh, don't mock. Remember what it meant to wear that suit. It meant you were a placeholder for science not yet born. It meant you would breathe pestilence and carry it into your skin. It meant you were chosen to count the dead until you joined them. Because history doesn't always remember the saviors. Sometimes it only remembers the masks they wore. Executioners were feared, hated, and lived in isolation. In the grim theater of medieval justice, one figure stood at the edge of the crowd, cloaked not in robes or armor, but in silence. The executioner, feared by criminals, loathed by citizens, and yet summoned by kings. His presence was necessary, his gaze avoided. He was both a servant of the law and a symbol of death, walking a razor's edge between duty and damnation. Executioners weren't born into their roles. They were often chosen by fate, circumstance, or punishment. In some cases, a criminal spared from death was forced to become the very thing he once feared. Others inherited the profession, passed down through families like a cursed heirloom because no one else would take the job. Once marked as an executioner, there was no turning back. You didn't just perform executions, you became one in the eyes of the world. They were paid well by the standards of the time. A clean beheading might earn them more than a common laborer would see in a month. But the coin came with a cost. Executioners were shunned. No one wanted to shake their hand, touch their clothes, or even share the same drinking cup. Children were warned to stay away. Women feared them. Men cursed them. Some towns forced executioners to live outside city walls, forbidden to walk freely among their neighbors. And so, they lived alone. Their homes were often built at the edge of cemeteries or beside gallows hills. They spent their days preparing nooses, sharpening blades, or disposing of corpses no one else would touch. At night, they drank. The screams of the dying, the weight of guilt, and the loneliness of exile carved deep trenches in their minds. Many turned to alcohol. Others lost their grip on reality. Madness was a common companion. Their role required precision. It wasn't just death, it was spectacle. Executions were public events meant to terrify and control. A botched job, a dull blade, a trembling hand meant suffering for the condemned and fury from the crowd. One executioner in 16th century Germany failed to behead a noble cleanly and was beaten by the mob until he died. Even when they did their job perfectly, the hatred never faded. They were needed, but never forgiven. Executioners bore the blood of others on their hands, sometimes literally, as they were often responsible for quartering bodies, boiling heads, or displaying severed limbs on spikes. The sight and smell of death followed them constantly. No prayers were said for them, no thanks were given. Yet without them, the justice system, brutal as it was, could not function. In France, the Sanson family served as executioners for 6 generations. Charles-Henri Sanson oversaw over 3,000 executions during the French Revolution, including that of King Louis XVI. His role was pivotal in one of the most volatile chapters of history, and yet he died with few friends and fewer mourners. The crowd that once cheered his precision came to see him as a monster. Executioners had to walk a strange line between justice and cruelty. Some became desensitized, others took pride in their work, but most simply endured. They were not evil men. They were instruments, tools sharpened by law and dulled by isolation. Some tried to reintegrate. They opened businesses, married, had children. But the stain followed them. Their children were bullied. Their shops were boycotted. In some places, laws even restricted their rights to worship or testify in court. Society demanded their service, then punished them for giving it. The few who spoke of their experiences described nightmares, shaking hands, and a constant sense of being watched, even when alone. Some claimed they heard whispers at night. Others saw the faces of those they had killed in the darkness. Whether this was guilt, madness, or something worse, no one can say. What's most tragic is that they were, in a sense, victims too. Victims of a world that outsourced its violence to a single man, then cast him out for doing what others demanded. Their touch was considered cursed. Their tools were feared. Their lives, while paid for in coin, were spent in a kind of walking death. And when their time came, there were no processions, no prayers. Often there were no graves, just silence, as if they had never existed at all. This is the story not of murderers, but of men caught in a machine too vast to stop. They were not remembered as heroes or villains. They were simply forgotten. Yet for centuries, their hands shaped history, one swing at a time. Millers lung-killed grain workers in dusty windmills. In the idyllic countryside of pre-industrial Europe, the windmill stood like a symbol of quiet productivity, its sails turning gently in the breeze, grinding grain into flour to feed growing villages and expanding cities. But behind the pastoral charm of these structures was a hidden killer, invisible to the eye and fatal to the lungs. It was known as Miller's lung, and it claimed the health and lives of countless grain workers who spent their days surrounded by airborne flour dust inside those wooden towers. The inside of a working mill was a storm of particulates. Grain grinding produced vast quantities of fine flour dust, so fine that it floated for hours, forming a thick, white fog that choked the air. Millers inhaled it constantly. There were no masks, no ventilation, no awareness of the danger. And as the years passed, many of these workers began to suffer the same mysterious fate: shortness of breath, chronic coughing, wheezing, fatigue, and ultimately, respiratory collapse. For centuries, the cause was unknown. Doctors of the time described it vaguely as consumption or wasting disease. In reality, it was a lethal inflammatory condition now known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis, triggered by repeated exposure to inhaled organic dust. The immune system of a miller, overwhelmed by years of flour-laden air, would begin attacking the lungs themselves. Inflammation would scar delicate alveoli, the tiny sacs responsible for oxygen exchange, reducing lung capacity and creating a slow suffocation that medicine of the era could neither identify nor treat. Many died in their 30s or 40s, their lungs irreparably damaged by the very food they helped create. And they were not alone. Miller's lung was part of a broader epidemic of occupational hazards during the early modern period. Just as chimney sweeps were dying of soot and tanners succumbed to noxious chemicals, millers were being poisoned by bread dust. The irony was bitter. The very ingredient that nourished nations was silently killing the people who processed it. Unlike coal miners, whose deaths could be dramatic and explosive, the death of a miller was slow and hidden. There were no cave-ins, no fiery blasts, only an increasing tightness in the chest, a struggle to breathe that turned everyday motion into agony. Workers reported coughing up white phlegm, sometimes streaked with blood. Sleep became shallow. Climbing stairs felt like climbing mountains. And then, often before age 50, they were gone. Some tried homemade remedies, herbs, honey, tonics, but nothing stopped the slow march of respiratory failure. The mills themselves became death traps. Their wooden frames trapped dust like coffins. Even simple cleaning stirred the air into a blizzard of floating particles. The constant vibration of grinding stones, combined with the dust-laden environment, created a perfect storm for lung disease. Over time, the death toll grew, and still, the mills turned. It wasn't until the 20th century that Miller's lung was properly studied and named. With the advent of pathology and industrial hygiene, researchers began examining the lungs of deceased millers and discovered patterns of fibrosis, granulomas, and immune overreaction. In some cases, infections from fungi present in spoiled grain made the condition worse. Aspergillus spores, commonly found in damp grain, would lodge deep in the lungs and thrive, compounding the inflammation with deadly mold infections. These infections, today called farmer's lung or miller's lung, often mimicked tuberculosis but resisted all known treatments of the time. What made the situation crueler was the isolation. Many millers were independent craftsmen, working alone or in small family units. There was no central oversight, no government protection, no labor movement to fight for clean air. They accepted their coughs as part of the job, just as a fisherman accepts the cold or a blacksmith the burns. Suffering became routine. Illness became identity. Generations of millers passed down not just trade secrets, but respiratory ailments. Fathers wheezing beside sons, unaware that their profession carried an unspoken sentence. This occupational legacy lingered even as industrial advances arrived. In larger mills, automation only increased the dust in the air, now circulated by metal fans and motors. Only in the late 20th century did governments begin enforcing dust control regulations, mandating proper ventilation, filters, and protective gear. But by then, the damage to countless lungs had already been done, unrecorded, unmourned, absorbed into the silent ledger of progress. Today, Miller's lung still exists. Modern flour processing plants have better protections, but workers in poorly regulated regions, especially in developing countries, continue to breathe the same dangerous dust. The symptoms are the same. The outcome, if left untreated, remains grim. The story of Miller's lung is not just medical history, it is a moral one. It reveals how invisible dangers can fester in plain sight, how entire professions can be sacrificed for food, for comfort, for progress. The beauty of a windmill, spinning gently across golden fields, masks the tragedy within. It is a reminder that even the most innocent-looking labor can carry hidden costs, and that the price of bread was never just grain and effort. It was breath, life, and generations of workers lost in a cloud of white. Charcoal burners lived alone in forests and died from carbon poisoning. In the deep forests of medieval and early modern Europe, far from the chatter of towns and the clang of city forges, there lived a group of men whose lives were defined by silence, smoke, and solitude. These were the charcoal burners, anonymous laborers whose work was essential to every blacksmith's hammer, every soldier's blade, every baker's oven, and every miner's flame. Without them, the fires that powered entire economies would have gone cold. Yet their own lives were cold in another sense, isolated, impoverished, and often cut tragically short by the very materials they handled. Charcoal was not just burned wood. It was a carefully crafted fuel, far more efficient than raw timber, prized for its slow, hot, smokeless burn. It was essential for smelting iron, forging tools, and operating kilns in a time before coal became widespread. But making charcoal was neither quick nor safe. It involved an ancient and painstaking process of slow pyrolysis, heating wood in the absence of oxygen to extract volatile gases and leave behind nearly pure carbon. To achieve this, charcoal burners built large earthen mounds or pits filled with chopped timber, which they covered with turf, soil, and ash. Then they lit the pile, sealed it, and waited. For days, sometimes weeks. A charcoal mound once lit had to smolder, not flame, steadily and silently. And the balance was delicate. Too much oxygen, and the pile burst into flames, destroying the batch and creating dangerous flare-ups. Too little, and the process failed entirely. So the burner had to stay close, always, watching, adjusting vents, patting down leaks, sleeping nearby, even in bitter cold or pouring rain, with only crude huts or lean-tos to shield them from the elements. They could not afford to leave. A moment's inattention could cost a month's work. It could also cost their life. The process released carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless, deadly gas. Inhaling it displaces oxygen in the blood, leading to dizziness, confusion, and unconsciousness. Many charcoal burners did not realize the danger. After long days inhaling low doses, they'd stumble back into their huts, lightheaded and exhausted, and fall asleep, only never to wake again. There were whispers that charcoal men were in league with dark forces, that they knew secrets of the earth no civilized man should know. In truth, they were just poor, often landless, sometimes criminals or drifters who had nowhere else to go. Their isolation wasn't just geographical, it was social. Charcoal burners rarely had families with them. The work was too remote, the danger too high, and the reward too small. In Germany's Black Forest, entire temporary camps of burners would spring up in summer, only to vanish with the season. In the English woods, their huts were called cabins of smoke, and children were warned not to approach them. In France and Italy, whole regions were known for their charbonniers, wandering clans of burners whose lives were passed down in ash and soot, often without written record, and the work never changed. Even as centuries passed, the tools remained crude: shovels, rakes, water barrels, iron pokers. The only technology was experience. A skilled burner could smell the venting gas and know when to shift the earth. He could hear a subtle hiss and know where the mound was leaking. But even masters were not immune to death. Carbon monoxide does not discriminate. It is silent, and it waits. If a man stayed too long inside his hut with the smoke creeping in, or if he lay too close to a leaking pit, his breath would slow, then stop. The fires they tended gave life to cities, but the fire itself took theirs. And what of their legacy? Very little remains. Few records, fewer names. They are ghosts in forest histories. Their contribution, like their deaths, went largely unnoticed. But without them, the swords of knights, the nails of ships, the wheels of carts, and the iron pots in kitchens might never have existed. Charcoal was foundational, and the men who made it paid the price. Today, their mounds are gone, reclaimed by moss and trees. But sometimes, if you walk deep enough into an old European forest, you'll find a flat, blackened patch of ground, or a circular depression surrounded by stones. That was a charcoal pit. That was where a man lived, watched, waited, and possibly died, his lungs filled not with fire, but with something far crueler, the ghost of it. Their lives were simple, but their deaths were complex. Because no man should have to die unseen, suffocated by the very thing he was forced to master. Yet for charcoal burners, that was the fate carved into every breath they took. Stone masons fell or were crushed. Building cathedrals. They were the unsung architects of awe, stone masons, whose hands shaped the soaring cathedrals that still pierce European skies today. Their work gave birth to the Gothic marvels of Notre Dame, Chartres, and Cologne. But behind the divine beauty lay brutal human cost. These cathedrals were not conjured by divine will. They were carved, brick, by men who risked everything and often died for it. Construction of a cathedral was no small feat. It could take generations, sometimes over a century, to complete. The workers who laid the foundations would not live to see the steeples. And yet, every day, they ascended makeshift wooden scaffolding, sometimes more than 100 feet in the air, with no harness, no safety net, just the stone and sky. The towering ambition of Gothic architecture, the ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows, required incredible precision and terrifying heights. These were not modern construction zones with steel girders and reinforced equipment. Scaffolding was primitive, wooden beams lashed together, creaking under weight, swaying in the wind. One misplaced foot, one loose knot, one weakened support, and the entire structure could collapse in seconds. Falls were common. Death was expected. Some masons didn't fall, but were crushed instead by stones they helped haul into place. One miscalculation in weight, one snapped rope or pulley, and hundreds of pounds of limestone would come crashing down, flattening whoever stood below. The work itself was relentless. Every stone had to be cut by hand. Masons used chisels, hammers, and iron tools to shape each block with mathematical precision. There were no machines to assist, only muscle memory and aching arms. And the stones weren't soft. Granite, marble, and limestone resisted every strike. Dust choked the air, tearing through lungs. Over time, masons developed silicosis, a slow suffocation caused by years of breathing in stone particles. Many died young. Those who lived bore crooked fingers, bent backs, and shattered knees from decades of climbing and carving. Their knowledge wasn't written in books, it was passed through apprenticeship. A boy would begin hauling buckets or sweeping fragments at the age of 10. If he survived long enough, he might become a journeyman, traveling from site to site. But few ever became master masons. That title required not just skill, but vision, to read geometry in empty space, to see arches where there was only air, and to command a team in an era where errors meant death. And still, they were not celebrated. Unlike the clergy or patrons who paid for the cathedrals, masons were anonymous. Their names rarely appear in records. You can see their marks, tiny symbols etched into stones to track their labor, but not their stories. No tombs were built for them. No songs were written in their honor. And yet, their legacy looms over us in every vaulted ceiling and spire. They built cathedrals in winter snow and summer heat. In rain, their tools slipped. In cold, the stone cracked. And yet they worked. They balanced giant stones with rudimentary cranes, often powered by men walking inside massive wooden treadmills. These devices, human-powered winches, lifted 1,000-pound stones into the air with nothing but brute force. One mistake in the rigging, one frayed rope, and disaster would follow. Even off the site, masons paid a price. The physical toll of the job made old age rare. They often suffered from chronic pain, arthritis, or permanent injuries. Alcohol and opiates became coping tools. Some were driven to madness by the combination of pressure, exhaustion, and pain. Others were crushed in the very buildings they helped raise. And yet, the paradox remains. These men, beaten and buried by their labor, built structures meant to touch the heavens. Cathedrals were designed to inspire awe, to direct the human gaze upward toward God. But few paused to look down, at the broken bodies lying in the dust below the scaffolding, at the blood that seeped into the mortar. The irony was cruel. These structures, symbols of divine glory, were born of human suffering. Every arch bore the weight of sacrifice. Every spire carried the echo of men who screamed as they fell. Every chime of the great bells, centuries later, still rings with the cost of forgotten lives. When you enter a cathedral and feel wonder at its scale, its light, its silence, remember this. That silence is not peace. It is absence. It is the silence of crushed ribs, of mangled limbs, of men who never came down from the scaffolding. Their voices are gone, but the stone remembers. So look again at the soaring columns and flying buttresses. They were not gifts from the heavens. They were paid for, in bone, in blood, and in silence. Blacksmiths inhaled toxic fumes and suffered iron burns daily. The anvil rang like a war drum. Sparks leapt like angry stars. And in the glowing heart of the forge, a man stood cloaked in soot, wielding a hammer like it was an extension of his soul. He was the blacksmith, iron's master, fire's companion, and history's most forgotten casualty. But this wasn't heroism. It was sacrifice. Because while he shaped weapons, chains, nails, and horseshoes, something else was shaping him. Something darker. The blacksmith's world was fire and metal. His hands were blistered, calloused, and cracked open from decades of gripping tongs and hammering steel. But that was only the surface. What truly destroyed blacksmiths wasn't the heat. It was what they breathed. Every strike of molten iron released a storm of invisible killers. Metal fumes laced with manganese, lead, zinc oxide, and iron oxide. The forge burned with coal and charcoal, filling the air with carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases no human was ever meant to inhale. There were no masks, no fans, no ventilation, just lungs that blackened with each breath. The symptoms crept in slowly: headaches, fatigue, tremors. Blacksmiths called it the shakes or the fever. Today, we call it metal fume fever, a toxic reaction to inhaling vaporized metals. But it didn't stop there. Prolonged exposure led to nerve damage, vision loss, memory failure, and early dementia. Some developed tremors so violent they could no longer hold a hammer. Others went blind from the glare of white-hot iron. And still, they worked. Because blacksmithing wasn't a job, it was survival. If you couldn't forge, you couldn't eat. The forge itself was a hellish altar. Temperatures soared above 1600 °F. Sparks erupted with every strike. A single slip could brand flesh with glowing metal. Third-degree burns were common. So were crushed fingers, bone fractures, severed tendons. A blacksmith's apron wasn't armor. It was a false sense of security soaked in sweat and blood. Ironically, many blacksmiths were revered. In medieval Europe, they were seen as mystical figures, men who tamed fire and bent the world's hardest substance. Some were believed to have magical powers. In Norse mythology, the gods relied on the dwarf blacksmiths to craft Thor's hammer. In Africa, blacksmiths were often part of a sacred caste, seen as mediators between the living and the spiritual world. But behind the myth was a man slowly being poisoned by his craft. Apprenticeships began young, sometimes at age 10. Boys were taught to pump the bellows, haul coal, and learn the rhythm of the hammer. But they also learned pain. Burns were initiation. Infections were constant. Even when treated, a burn from glowing slag could leave permanent damage, and few apprentices survived to become masters. Many died of lung infections, pneumonia, or complications from untreated wounds. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptic, just soot, sweat, and stubbornness. In the Renaissance, the demand for metal tools surged: plows, armor, swords, nails, hinges. Blacksmiths became vital, but their lives grew shorter. Cities expanded, workloads doubled, and the air inside the forges thickened into poison. By age 40, many blacksmiths had the lungs of dying coal miners. By 50, if they lived that long, their bodies were twisted, spines warped from years of hammering, hands gnarled, knees shattered. They couldn't stop. If they rested, they starved. The sound of hammering wasn't just noise, it was trauma. Constant exposure to high decibel ringing, 100 decibels or more, led to progressive hearing loss. Blacksmiths grew deaf, but worse than deafness was the tinnitus, the endless ringing that haunted them even in sleep. Some drank to cope, others grew violent. The line between the forge and the battlefield blurred. A man who made swords all day found it easier to use one. In some regions, retired blacksmiths were feared. Driven half-mad by fumes and pain, they were said to talk to the fire or strike iron that wasn't there. By the Industrial Revolution, blacksmiths began to vanish, replaced by factories, machines, assembly lines. But even in factories, the danger didn't disappear. Workers still inhaled fumes, still suffered burns, still died young. Only now, they died anonymously. And yet, blacksmiths are everywhere, in the legacy of the tools they left behind. The horseshoes buried under roads, the nails in cathedral beams, the blades in old display cases. Their work outlived them, but their pain was buried. We romanticize them now, strong men with sparks flying behind them. But we forget the smell: burnt hair, melted leather, scorched skin. We forget the sound of coughing in the early morning, the blood on the anvil, the silence of deaf ears. A blacksmith didn't just fight fire, he inhaled it. And in return, it burned his lungs from the inside out. The next time you pass a wrought iron gate or admire a hand-forged blade, stop. Somewhere in its history is a man who sacrificed his breath, his skin, and his sanity to shape it. A man who died with soot in his lungs and hammer marks in his bones. The blacksmith is gone, but the fire remembers. Scribes and illuminators went blind from tiny inkwork. They sat hunched over parchment, hour after hour, day after day, in silence broken only by the scratching of quills and the slow drip of melted wax. In cold stone monasteries and dimly lit scriptoriums, medieval scribes and illuminators gave their lives, quite literally, to the art of the written word. What they created would preserve centuries of knowledge, religion, science, and myth. But the cost of their devotion was blindness, pain, and physical ruin. Before the invention of the printing press, every book had to be copied by hand. Every word, every letter, every intricate illustration was the result of painstaking labor. Scribes were often monks, men of faith sworn to a life of silence and obedience. For them, writing was not just a task, it was worship. Each manuscript was a sacred object, but behind the reverence lay suffering few ever imagined. Most scriptoriums were dim. Candles flickered weakly against stone walls, offering just enough light to write, but not enough to see clearly. Scribes leaned in close, too close, for 12 to 16 hours a day, straining their eyes to differentiate between minuscule marks on rough parchment. They used iron gall ink, a mixture of tannin, vitriol, and gum arabic, dark, corrosive, and staining. Over years of exposure and squinting in the dark, many lost their vision entirely. Some gradually went blind. Others began seeing only shadows before their eyesight vanished forever. And it wasn't just the eyes that paid the price. The body twisted with the task. Scribes sat on wooden benches with no back support, hunched over desks angled forward. Their necks craned downward for hours. Their hands cramped from the delicate control needed to keep the script uniform. Many developed what modern medicine would diagnose as severe kyphosis or scoliosis. Historical records refer to the scribe's stoop, a deformity caused by years of unnatural posture. Some could no longer stand upright. Illuminators, those who painted the vivid decorations that adorned medieval manuscripts, suffered just as much, if not more. Their job required precision so fine that some details were painted with brushes made of a single hair. To create the vibrant colors of their illustrations, they used materials that would horrify any modern chemist: powdered lead for red, arsenic for yellow, mercury-based cinnabar for bright vermilion. Over time, these pigments absorbed through their skin or were inhaled in dust form. The result? Poisoning, tremors, madness, and premature death. Despite this, the work continued. The church demanded copies of Scripture. Nobles paid handsomely for illuminated psalters and prayer books. Knowledge needed preserving. There was no rest, no relief. Some scribes were forbidden from even speaking during their labors, communicating only through gestures. In winter, they wrote while their fingers froze. In summer, their sweat smudged their work. Mistakes were punishable, sometimes harshly. A single blotch on a valuable manuscript could mean starting over. Yet there was beauty in the agony. Some of the most breathtaking books in human history emerged from these rooms of quiet torment. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Tres Riches Heures. These weren't just texts, they were masterpieces. Every illuminated letter, every gold leaf halo, every curling vine or mythical beast had been born of human endurance pushed to the edge. Many scribes left behind notes, marginalia, tiny inscriptions buried between lines or at the end of texts. Some are humorous, "Oh, my hand," or "Thank God it will soon be dark." Others are bitter, "I am very cold." Let the reader remember the work of the scribe, or even, "This page has been written with much pain." These tiny cries from the past give us a glimpse into the emotional and physical toll of their labor. The scribes knew their sacrifices would not bring them fame. Their names were rarely recorded, but they continued. They believed in the permanence of their work, in the power of ideas etched in ink. Without them, entire libraries of classical knowledge, from Aristotle to Galen, would have vanished in the Dark Ages. Without their patience, there would be no records of early laws, no preserved scripture, no foundation for the books we read today. But make no mistake, these were not lives of scholarly luxury. They were lives of discipline, silence, and pain. Some went blind before completing their final manuscripts. Others were buried with ink-stained fingers and curved spines. They gave everything to words that were not even their own. The next time you see a medieval manuscript behind museum glass, look closely. Behind the gold and the ink, beneath the parchment, are invisible lines written in sacrifice, lines etched not just with quills, but with vision, health, and years of suffering. This is the legacy of the scribes and illuminators. They worked in silence so knowledge could speak. They went blind so others could see. Salt workers in coastal pans died from skin rot and organ damage. In the shimmering heat of coastal salt pans, where the sun beat down on endless white plains and the wind carried the sharp scent of brine, men and women toiled from dawn until dusk, harvesting one of the world's most essential minerals, salt. It preserved food, healed wounds, and maintained trade routes. Civilizations were built on it. Wars were fought over it. But for the workers who extracted it by hand, salt was not a symbol of wealth or preservation. It was slow destruction. Their skin blistered and split, their bodies broke down, and over time, their organs silently failed. Salt, for them, was not life. It was death in crystalline form. Salt pans, especially in pre-industrial coastal regions, were sprawling basins where seawater was trapped and left to evaporate under the sun. What remained was a crust of salt, scraped by hand using long wooden tools. Workers spent their days ankle-deep in hypersaline water under unrelenting sun. The salt, while lifeblood to commerce, was poison to human tissue. Every exposed patch of skin became raw and inflamed. Their feet, submerged for hours, developed open sores. The salt drew out moisture, cracked skin to the bone, and left workers vulnerable to deadly infections. Even gloves and shoes, where available, quickly failed, eaten through by the very mineral they harvested. But this was just the surface. Inhaling salt particles over time began to scar the lungs. The eyes, constantly exposed to glare, reflecting off the salt fields, often developed pterygium or other vision issues. Some workers went blind. The kidneys and liver, overburdened by chronic salt exposure and dehydration, began to fail. Water was precious in these places, yet the work itself drained it from the body faster than it could be replenished. Internal organs began to suffer under the constant strain of salt imbalance. The damage was invisible at first. Then came the fatigue, the cramps, the nausea, the slow collapse of internal systems. And all of this for pennies. Despite the brutal toll, salt work was often the only reliable employment in poor coastal towns. These were communities forgotten by industry and bypassed by mechanization. The salt pans, vast and ancient, offered a consistent, if fatal, wage. Children joined the labor force early, working alongside parents in the blazing sun. Women carried heavy baskets. Old men raked endless fields of crystal. Generations were consumed by the work. There were no medical facilities, no unions, no recourse, just sweat, salt, and early death. Historical records from regions like India's coastal Gujarat, France's Camargue, and parts of West Africa show strikingly similar patterns. Salt laborers often lived shorter lives than any other local profession. Skin diseases were rampant. Leprosy-like infections, known colloquially as salt rot, devoured flesh from the hands and feet. Nails blackened and fell off. Flesh turned white, then red, then darkened with necrosis. Even bathing couldn't cleanse the body. The salt had soaked in too deep. In some areas, the workers were enslaved or bonded laborers, trapped in debt cycles that passed down through families. In West African salt mines like those of Taudeni, enslaved workers lived in unimaginable conditions, carving slabs of salt from deep within the earth and transporting them across the Sahara. They, too, were eroded by the mineral they carried. And while the elite used salt to preserve meats and flaunt wealth, the men who mined it decayed from within. Salt's cultural and economic significance masked its human cost. Ancient Rome paid soldiers in salt, hence the word salary. But the people extracting it weren't salaried, they were sacrificed. History lauded salt routes, salt taxes, salt empires. But rarely did it speak of the hands that bled, the skin that cracked, the lives cut short. Salt became so ubiquitous, so valuable, that society ignored the pain buried beneath its brilliance. The Industrial Revolution introduced machines and safer extraction techniques in some parts of the world, but many coastal salt pans continued to rely on manual labor well into the 20th century, and still do in parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Today, thousands continue to work in dangerous conditions, barefoot and exposed, harvesting the mineral that flavors and preserves food for millions. Many are still paid less than a living wage. Many still suffer the same ailments as their ancestors. Salt's legacy is one of duality. To the world, it is a gift, a preservative, a necessity, a seasoning. But to the workers of the pans, it has always been a quiet executioner. It stripped them bare, inside and out, and offered only the illusion of stability. Their labor was invisible, their suffering ignored, their deaths unmarked by monuments. To remember the history of salt workers is to remember that every grain has a cost, that even the most common substance can carry the weight of generations of pain, and that beneath the clean white sparkle of the salt pans lies a ground soaked with sacrifice. Messenger boys froze, starved, or were robbed on the road. They were the veins of a kingdom's nervous system. Young boys, barely into their teens, dispatched alone into the wilds with nothing but a sealed letter, a sliver of authority, and a deep understanding that failure was not an option. They were the messenger boys, the unsung lifeline of empires and kings, entrusted to carry missives across treacherous lands, through hostile forests, across frozen passes, and into towns where one wrong move could mean imprisonment or death. In an age before telegraphs, before trains, before any instant form of communication, these boys were the message itself, moving through a landscape that could swallow them whole. Most came from poverty. Orphans, peasants, or the children of low-ranking servants, they were small, nimble, and quick. A perfect fit for a courier who needed to travel light and remain unnoticed. Nobles and warlords preferred them young, believing their innocence would attract less suspicion, and that their desperation would keep them loyal. Some were pressed into service, others volunteered, lured by promises of coin or favor. But what they weren't told, what no one told them, was how truly dangerous their work was. They carried royal edicts, battle plans, marriage arrangements, tax demands, secret threats, and sometimes coded messages only a monarch and his general could decipher. In their satchels, bound by wax and seal, was power, power that others would kill for. Bandits watched the roads. Rebel forces waited for just such opportunities. A lone rider on foot or pony, wearing nothing more than threadbare wool and a leather pouch. Easy prey. The road was a hunting ground, and these boys were often the bait. In winter, the dangers multiplied. There were no heated outposts, no weather reports, no warm inns along the lesser paths. Snow turned roads to traps. Thin ice cracked under weight. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes, and when firewood ran out, boys simply stopped moving. Many were found curled beneath trees or in shallow ditches, their limbs stiff, eyes open, the letters they carried still clutched in blue hands. Their loyalty outlasted their lives. Starvation was common. Messenger boys weren't wealthy. They carried little food, and stopping to hunt or beg delayed their mission. But hunger slowed the body, and in a cold forest, a slow boy is a dead boy. Some gnawed roots, others ate moss. Some were killed by wolves, real ones, or the humankind. In some regions, local villagers feared these ragged messengers, believing they were spies or plague carriers. They were chased off, beaten, or worse. their only crime being the voice of someone more powerful. Yet they kept walking. There are records, fragments really, of messages never received, missives that disappeared into the wilderness with no explanation. In wartime, a single lost letter could mean the fall of a castle or the death of a noble. Sometimes, bodies were found later, torn by animals or stripped by thieves. Other times, nothing remained, just a rumor that a boy had left the last village and never arrived at the next. A few were lucky. Some grew into roles as royal couriers or scribes, but most were chewed up by the system, used and discarded. If a boy made a mistake, if he opened a letter, lost a seal, arrived late, or gave the wrong message to the wrong person, the consequences could be brutal. Flogging was common, imprisonment too. In some kingdoms, the penalty for tampering with royal communication was death, and kings enforced it. Because one message, sent or stolen, could change everything. Messenger boys weren't warriors, but they faced the same perils. They weren't scholars, but they bore knowledge that could turn tides. They weren't nobles, but they were often closer to power than any baron or knight. Yet they had no protection, no escort, just a letter and a road that could eat them alive. They crossed battlefields in disguise, swam across rivers with letters tied in waterproofed skin, crawled through forests and scaled mountains with bleeding hands. Some rode donkeys, most walked, all ran. Because the letter had to reach its destination, even if they didn't. Today, we romanticize the idea of the brave messenger, the lone figure racing across the land with a scroll of fate. But the reality was colder, hungrier, bloodier. These were children sent to navigate adult dangers, boys made into shadows, ghosts between cities, forgotten in snowdrifts, buried under moss, or lost forever to the silent mouths of wolves. No statues were built for them, no songs were sung, yet they carried kingdoms on their backs. Bell ringers were crushed by falling weights and deafened for life. High above the village square, where sunlight touched the highest stones of a church tower, stood the bell ringer, alone, suspended between heaven and earth, and forever at risk of being killed by the very sound he created. The bells they rang were symbols of faith, power, and time itself. But for those who worked them, they were monstrous machines of iron and motion, waiting for a moment's mistake to deal death or permanent damage. Medieval and early modern church bells were not small instruments. Some weighed thousands of pounds, massive bronze giants suspended in wooden frames, hanging high in towers that swayed with every gust of wind. They were rung to mark hours, warn of fire, call to worship, or mourn the dead. But for the bell ringer, each toll came with the risk of becoming the next one mourned. Ringing these bells wasn't as simple as pulling a rope. The force required to move the clapper or swing the bell itself was enormous. A bell that weighed over a ton could take several men to move, and once in motion, it obeyed only physics. Bell ropes stretched stories below the tower, coiled with potential energy. And if a ringer got caught in the wrong loop or wrapped in a whipping rope, they could be violently yanked into the air, flung against stone, or slammed into wooden beams. There are accounts, many of them, of bell ringers being launched upward when a swinging bell's momentum tightened the rope too fast. Some were thrown through trapdoors. Others were crushed by the counterweights, caught beneath the descending mechanisms. There were even cases where bell ringers were decapitated, the rope wrapping around their neck before the bell surged with force. These were not rare accidents, they were occupational hazards. Then there was the sound, deafening, crushing, inescapable. To be in the belfry when the bells tolled was to step into a storm of sound, waves of pressure that shattered equilibrium and eardrums. Bells weren't designed for human hearing at close range. The acoustics inside a tower amplified every strike. A ringer could not escape the ringing. They were inside the sound itself. No earplugs, no protection, just metal on metal, again and again. Long-term bell ringers often went deaf. Some suffered tinnitus, an unending ring that haunted them long after the bells had fallen silent. Others lost their balance permanently as the vibrations damaged the delicate organs of the inner ear. Dizziness, migraines, memory issues, these became the quiet companions of men who spent years in the towers. They didn't know the science of it, but they knew the cost. And still, they rang. Bell ringing was considered a sacred duty. In many towns, the bell ringer was respected, even revered. They held the rhythm of the town in their calloused hands. When danger approached, a fire, a flood, an invading army, it was the bell ringer who sounded the alarm. When the hour struck, it was their pull that marked the passage of time. In death and celebration alike, their tolls guided the emotions of entire communities. Some churches employed full teams of bell ringers to create elaborate peals, complex sequences of sound requiring perfect timing and teamwork. These performances were beautiful, but dangerous. Misstep the rhythm, and someone could get caught in a swinging rope or mistime their release. In large towers, the bells could move with such force that the entire structure shook. Timber groaned, mortar cracked. Bell towers occasionally collapsed entirely, burying their ringers under the very stones they once stirred to life. In some regions, the job passed from father to son. It became a generational echo, one ringer replacing another, each one slowly losing their hearing, each one knowing the risks. Boys were taught early how to hold the rope, how to avoid the fatal loops. But youth often brought misjudgment. Many novices were maimed or killed within weeks of starting. They were quick to learn or quick to vanish. By the 19th century, the dangers were finally recognized more widely. Some churches redesigned bell mechanisms to reduce human interaction. Counterweights were enclosed. Ropes were shortened. Later came electric ringing systems, precise, mechanical, and cold. But something was lost. The human connection, the embodied rhythm of a man and a bell moving together, began to fade. The haunting danger gave way to sterile automation. And yet, in certain places, tradition persists. There are still towers where the bells are rung by hand, where the ropes still whip and coil with centuries of weight behind them. And in those towers, you'll find men and women who accept the risk, who feel the history echo in their bones, who go deaf for the sound of time. So when you hear a bell toll, at a wedding, at a funeral, in a quiet churchyard, listen closely. That sound was once a death sentence. It was the final note in a life lived among ropes and bronze, echoing not just through air, but through bones and blood. It was not only a call to prayer, but a tolling of sacrifice. The bell rang for all, but it took its toll from the one who rang it. Roof thatchers constantly fell to their deaths. They stood where no one else dared, on rooftops made of straw, balanced over splintered beams, barefoot and wind-battered. No harness, no helmet, no rope, just calloused feet and years of instinct. They were roof thatchers, the silent workers who kept rain off your bed and death inches from their own. And most of them never reached middle age. In the quiet villages of medieval Europe, roof thatching was a craft as old as shelter itself. Generations of men climbed onto crude timber frames to bind bundles of straw, reeds, or heather into tightly packed thatch, designed to shed water and insulate homes. It was an ancient art, elegant in design, brutal in practice. Because what no one tells you is this: most thatchers died not from age or illness, but from the fall. They worked high on angled wooden rafters, slick with morning dew, brittle from sun or rot. The straw beneath them shifted like sand. One wrong step, one sudden gust, and they were gone. Snapped neck, shattered spine, skull cracked open on the cobblestone below. There were no safety nets, no scaffolds, and certainly no regulations. If you fell, you died. If you survived, you were rarely the same. Thatchers worked barefoot, not out of tradition, but necessity. Boots slipped, soles tore on sharp straw and splinters. Only raw feet could grip the wooden beams. And even then, many slipped anyway. They learned to walk the pitch of a roof like a dancer, hunched low, balancing bundles of thatch under one arm, a hand sickle in the other. Children watched them from below as if watching a circus act, except the applause never came, only silence when one didn't get up. Apprenticeships began early. Boys as young as 12 were taught to haul straw, climb frames, and tie knots with frozen fingers. They'd start on low barns, learning to press thatch so tightly it could last 30 years without leaking. But it was the houses, those tall, narrow cottages, that demanded a different kind of courage. By 15, they were already climbing 2-story ladders held together by twine and hope. By 20, many had already buried a coworker. Thatching wasn't just dangerous, it was exhausting. A full roof could take weeks, even months, to finish. In summer, the straw burned your skin. In winter, it froze your bones. Hands bled from constant friction, shoulders locked from lifting bundles, knees swelled, and there was always the wind, the ever-present enemy. One hard gust could send a man flying. It happened often, too often. If you were lucky, you broke bones. If you weren't, they buried you beneath the very roof you helped build. No church bells rang for a fallen thatcher. No rich man came to mourn. That work was invisible, needed, but never honored. If a roof leaked, people cursed the craft. If it didn't, they forgot who made it. Few thatchers lived beyond 40. Those who did walked with a permanent limp or a crooked spine. Some went blind from years staring into the sun. Others coughed from mold, dust, and broken straw buried in their lungs. But the work never stopped. Roofs decayed. Weather changed. And people always needed shelter. In towns like Norfolk, Devon, and Somerset, thatchers formed tight-knit guilds, not for protection, but for burial rights. They pooled money to ensure that when one of them fell, there would be enough to bury him decently. Some roofs bear carvings of tools, hooks, bundles, a feathered ridge, not as decoration, but as silent tributes to the dead, to the men who paid for every inch of shelter with the risk of their own blood. And still, the craft survived, because thatch was life. In places with no slate, no tile, no clay, it was all they had. It kept newborns warm. It shielded the dying. It gave poor families dignity. And it came with a price measured in broken bones, lost teeth, shattered skulls, and lives cut short. The modern world forgot. Roofs now come with scaffolds and harnesses, safety boots, OSHA. But in remote villages, even today, traditional thatchers still climb the way their ancestors did, barefoot, with straw over shoulder and death below. Tourists marvel at the quaint beauty of thatched roofs. Few wonder who built them. Fewer still ask how many didn't live to finish the job. You don't see their names carved in wood. You don't see their faces in history books. But they're there, in the slant of every cottage roof, in the curve of every ridgeline, in the hush of every storm that doesn't seep through. They were craftsmen, daredevils, human anchors clinging to rooftops with only balance and bravery. The next time you see a thatched roof, pause. Know that it wasn't just built. It was risked. It was dared. It was survived, barely. And somewhere beneath that straw, a man once balanced barefoot on a rafter, hands shaking, wind howling, heart racing, just trying to finish the job before the fall came for him too. Because for a roof thatcher, it wasn't if, it was always when. Rat catchers faced bites, disease, and died. During plague times, they walked the filth-covered alleys with sacks slung over their shoulders and sticks in their hands, hunting shadows that scurried beneath floorboards and into walls. Rat catchers, unseen soldiers in the battle for public health, lived lives soaked in danger, stench, and silence. In the darkest corners of medieval and early modern cities, these men waged a desperate war against vermin. But the price of this fight was more than most could bear. They were bitten, infected, and forgotten, often dying from the very plagues they helped contain. Long before the world understood germs or bacteria, cities overflowed with waste. Sewers were primitive, if they existed at all. Food was stored poorly, sanitation was nearly non-existent, and rats flourished. Not the timid ones you see today, but massive, disease-carrying monsters that spread filth wherever they ran. And at the heart of this infestation was the rat catcher, trained not by books, but by blood, instinct, and trial. Most rat catchers came from the lowest rungs of society, men with nothing to lose and everything to fear. They worked alone or with dogs, ferrets, and sometimes even their own children, plunging into basements, sewers, and garbage heaps to track and kill rats by the hundreds. Gloves were rare. Protective gear didn't exist. Their weapons were simple: a stick, a cage, a trap, and sometimes just their bare hands. Each day was a gamble with infection. Rats don't go quietly. They scratch, bite, and draw blood. And in that blood was death. Fleas leapt from rodent to man in seconds, many carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the bubonic plague. The Black Death didn't just decimate Europe in the 14th century. It lingered in outbreaks for centuries, and wherever plague struck, rat catchers were often the first exposed. Ironically, these men were both saviors and suspects. Town officials hired them to reduce the rat population, but ordinary citizens feared them. They smelled of the things people tried to forget: death, disease, filth. Some believed they were cursed or brought plague with them. Superstition followed them through every alley. In London, rat catchers were required to wear visible badges to mark their trade, as if to warn others, "Here walks death." They rarely lived long. In times of plague, their mortality rate soared. Many disappeared, their corpses found in alleyways or never recovered at all. Yet when the crisis passed, their memory vanished just as quickly. Banshikoi. No monuments, no ceremonies, only whispers and the occasional grim woodcut in a dusty book. Some made a living by selling the very animals they caught, caged rats used in dogfights or for scientific study. Others created powders and tonics made from crushed rats, falsely advertised as plague cures or warding potions. It was a grotesque survival tactic, born of desperation. For many, rat catching wasn't just a job, it was the last option before starvation. They were never idle. Cities never stopped breeding rats. Markets overflowed with spoiled food. Ships brought more vermin with every docking. Even royal courts required rat catchers, some given the official title of the Royal Rat Catcher. In one case, Jack Black, a Victorian-era rat catcher, was appointed by Queen Victoria herself. He dressed in flamboyant clothes, bred color-mutated rats for noble pets, and still risked his life daily in the sewers of London. Still, prestige meant little when the teeth sank in. The wounds from rat bites often festered. Rabies, tetanus, and sepsis were common. A scratch could turn black, a fever could rise, and death could come in days. And yet these men returned to the streets each morning, chasing rats into darkness, knowing what awaited them. Some rat catchers kept journals or passed down tricks of the trade: how to bait a trap, how to listen for rats behind walls, how to tell if an attic was hiding hundreds or just one. Their knowledge was hard-earned, practical, and often ignored by polite society. Only when the death toll climbed did people remember the ones beneath the city who tried to stop it. Even today, echoes of their work remain. The modern pest control industry was born from their lineage. The gear is safer, the science clearer, but the essence remains: find the threat no one else wants to face. In a sense, the rat catchers were early epidemiologists, risking everything to protect a world that never thanked them. They were scratched, bitten, spat on, and ignored. Yet they kept going, not for glory, not for fame, but because someone had to. This is the story of the rat catchers, men who entered the city's disease-ridden guts to fight an enemy that never slept. They faced plague not in palaces or hospitals, but in the rot beneath the floorboards. And though they died alone, they lived in service to a world that didn't even know it needed saving. Alchemists poisoned themselves with mercury and arsenic. In flickering candlelight and beneath vaulted stone ceilings, the alchemists of the Middle Ages and Renaissance bent over their crucibles, inhaling fumes and mixing strange powders with trembling precision. They believed they were on the verge of unlocking nature's most sacred codes, transforming base metals into gold, distilling the elixir of eternal life, or uncovering the divine spark hidden in matter. But while their ambitions reached toward the divine, their methods dealt in poison. For centuries, alchemists unknowingly destroyed their bodies with mercury, arsenic, lead, and countless other deadly substances, victims of their own blind pursuit. Alchemists weren't the charlatans history sometimes paints them as. They were often proto-scientists, philosophers, theologians, and dreamers. Their texts were a fusion of mysticism, chemistry, astrology, and esoteric symbolism. But their laboratories were treacherous places, with no understanding of toxicity, no ventilation, and no protection beyond heavy robes and blind faith. These early experimenters routinely exposed themselves to substances that we now recognize as some of the most lethal in existence. Mercury, a silvery liquid metal, was central to their work. Believed to be the prima materia, the universal element from which all matter derived, it was a cornerstone of alchemical transformation. Alchemists observed its mysterious behavior, fluid, reflective, and capable of dissolving metals like gold. To them, mercury was the key to transmutation and the philosopher's stone. They heated it, inhaled its vapors, rubbed it on their skin, and sometimes even ingested it in minute amounts, believing it might balance bodily humors or extend life. But mercury's touch was deathly. Chronic exposure caused tremors, hallucinations, memory loss, and severe emotional instability, a condition now called Mad Hatter syndrome, due to its later appearance in 18th century hat makers. Alchemists began to suffer similar symptoms: paranoia, trembling hands, blackened teeth, and early death became common among practitioners. Many went mad. Some documented visions or divine insights, likely symptoms of acute mercury poisoning. And yet, the work continued. For many, the promise of gold or immortality justified any suffering. Then came arsenic. Known to ancient civilizations but fully embraced by alchemists, arsenic compounds were used both as catalysts and for pigmentation, especially in green dyes. Alchemists believed arsenic held purifying properties and used it in pursuits of perfection. But arsenic is a silent killer. Its vapors damage lungs, its dust settles into skin, and its ingestion, accidental or otherwise, leads to organ failure. Alchemists who handled arsenic powders without gloves or masks slowly rotted from within. Some died in days. Others deteriorated over months, believing their wasting bodies were part of a spiritual trial. Lead, too, played a role. Easily melted and malleable, it was thought to be a potential precursor to gold. Alchemists tried again and again to convert it, unaware that the very act of working with molten lead in closed quarters meant inhaling toxic fumes that scarred their lungs and poisoned their blood. The tragedy is compounded by how little they understood the danger. The more their health declined, the more they doubled down, thinking their suffering was part of the alchemical journey. To many, decay was a sign of spiritual cleansing. In the alchemical metaphor, base matter had to be destroyed before it could be reborn as gold. Genus. This included the body. The pain, the hallucinations, even death, were often interpreted as signs that transformation, spiritual or material, was near. Some alchemists documented their agonies. Basil Valentine, a 15th century German alchemist, wrote of the destructive power of antimony, another toxic element commonly used in alchemical experiments. Paracelsus, perhaps the most famous of them all, coined the phrase, "the dose makes the poison." acknowledging that even medicine could be fatal in the wrong hands. But by then, hundreds, perhaps thousands, had already suffered mercury madness, arsenic ulcers, and lead-induced paralysis in the name of knowledge. And it wasn't just physical. Their work often drove them into social isolation. Alchemy was secretive, riddled with symbolism and coded texts, partly to protect their discoveries and partly to keep dangerous knowledge from the uninitiated. Many alchemists worked in solitude, surrounded by crucibles, alembics, and strange metals. Their bodies failed, their minds deteriorated, and still they chased gold they could not create and immortality they would never achieve. The irony is haunting. In trying to master the building blocks of life, alchemists became martyrs to chemistry. Their deaths taught later generations what not to do. The fumes they inhaled revealed the need for ventilation. The lesions on their skin revealed the cost of touching raw compounds. The madness they documented hinted at the neurological effects of heavy metals. Their suffering became the foundation of toxicology, pharmacology, and modern chemistry. Today, we remember alchemy with a mix of skepticism and awe. We mock the old dream of turning lead into gold, yet we now transmute elements in particle accelerators. We dismiss the search for elixirs of life, yet modern biotech chases anti-aging solutions with equal fervor. The difference is knowledge. The alchemists died for theirs. Their legacy isn't gold. It's the warning in their bones, the caution in their stained manuscripts, the silent scream behind every mystical diagram. They reached for eternity and dissolved into dust. Shipbuilders were crushed under timber or drowned during launches. In the shipyards of old maritime empires, along the fog-choked coasts of England, the salt-stung harbors of Portugal, the roaring docks of the Netherlands, an invisible war was waged between wood and water. And the men who fought it were the shipbuilders, craftsmen of the sea, laborers of legend, whose sweat carved the skeletons of empire. But for all the glory of tall ships with billowing sails, for every vessel that launched with fanfare, there were crushed bones, shattered spines, and cold, silent drownings beneath the very planks they laid. Building a wooden ship was not simply a matter of nailing boards. It was an orchestration of brute force, balance, and timing, an epic struggle to bend nature into something seaworthy. And the raw material of choice, timber, did not yield easily. The logs used for keels, masts, and hull frames were enormous, hauled from distant forests by oxen or floated down rivers. They could be 100 feet long and weigh multiple tons. A single misstep while hoisting one into place could mean instant death. Shipbuilders were often crushed beneath falling beams or pinned between swinging timbers and scaffolds. There was no time to scream, just a sharp crack and silence. In the great naval dockyards, the work was relentless. Men climbed to precarious heights to hammer iron bolts into ribs. Others stooped low beneath half-finished hulls where shadows clung like mist to seal the ship's belly with hot tar and pitch. These mixtures, made of rosin, turpentine, and oil, bubbled in iron cauldrons, giving off toxic fumes that burned the lungs and blurred vision. One slip meant plunging into the boiling mix. A fall while working underneath meant being entombed alive beneath the ship's rising body, as timbers slammed into place with the weight of a cathedral. The screams of trapped men were sometimes muffled by the hammering above, until they stopped altogether. The lower decks, when under construction, were pits of darkness and suffocating fumes. Men had to crawl into the narrowing spaces between frame and hull to apply sealant, hammer nails, or inspect joints. These were narrow, airless voids where lamps flickered and breath grew short. Many passed out from lack of oxygen. Some suffocated entirely. Others simply disappeared, slipped between scaffolds, drowned in rising tides, or crushed by rolling logs misjudged by a moment. And then there was the launch. When a ship was finally complete, a ceremony would be held. Ribbons, speeches, and royal observers masked the real terror. The moment the massive hull, weighing hundreds of tons, would be released from its dry berth into the open water. The method was primitive, a system of greased wooden slips and angled rails. The entire ship, perched like a sleeping beast, would begin to slide. And if something went wrong, if the ship caught, tilted, or shifted, men could be pulled under the keel, dragged into the sea, or flattened beneath a falling mass of timber and steel. Some were sent into the water with ropes, tasked with guiding the launch. If the line snapped, the recoil could rip off arms. If the ship veered, it crushed entire crews against the dock walls. Blood mixed with seawater. Cheers were followed by gasps. And still they built. They built under sun, under frost, in rain, and in storm. They built ships for kings, for war, for trade, for discovery. They did so with calloused hands, missing fingers, and backs twisted from lifting the world one log at a time. Injuries were constant. Lost eyes from flying splinters, crushed feet, burns from molten pitch, and for every injury, a replacement waited. Because shipyards never stopped. Apprentices learned the trade by watching others die. A boy might start by sweeping sawdust, then progress to hauling bolts, climbing rigging, tarring seams. If he was lucky, he grew old. If not, his name became just another whisper in the salt wind. There were no safety standards, no compensation. A man who died beneath a falling mast was unlucky, not protected. His family mourned without answers, and the ship sailed anyway, perhaps to war, perhaps to trade spices in distant ports, carrying with it the ghosts of its builders sealed into its seams. And what's worse, no monument remembers them. When we admire the grandeur of the HMS Victory or the sleek hull of a galleon, we rarely ask who died making it, but someone did, often more than one. The polished decks were once slick with blood. The carved railings were sanded by men who could no longer feel their hands, and the deep belly of the ship was darkened not just by tar, but by loss. The ocean is merciless. But so was the labor that gave ships the strength to face it. And the shipbuilders, those silent architects of empire, paid the price in crushed bones, drowned lungs, and fire-blackened skin. All so their nations could float a little further into history, leaving the bodies of their makers behind in the Saudi. Field reapers suffered heat stroke, infection, and blade injuries. They were called reapers not by myth or legend, but by necessity. Before machines rolled through golden fields, it was human hands that harvested the land's bounty. Field reapers, men, women, and even children, swung scythes under merciless suns, cutting grain from the earth one exhausting sweep at a time. It was backbreaking, blistering, and often fatal work. Their lives were dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the cruelty of the harvest. At dawn, when the fields were still soaked with dew, reapers would rise. They tied cloths around their hands and faces, not for comfort, but for survival. With crude wooden handles and curved iron blades, they stepped into tall crops, wheat, barley, rye, ready to spend the next 12 to 16 hours bent at the waist, repeating the same motion over and over again. Swing, cut, gather, bind, repeat, for days, for weeks, for years. The sun showed no mercy. There were no shaded rest stops, no breaks unless the overseer allowed it. Heat stroke was common. Some collapsed mid-row, their bodies shutting down from dehydration and exhaustion. Others would continue pushing, seeing spots, limbs shaking, until they fell, face first, into the same earth they had fed for so long. Some never rose again. But it wasn't just the heat that killed, it was the blades. Scythes and sickles were unforgiving tools. A single misstep could slash muscle, sever tendons, or carve through bone. In crowded fields, accidents multiplied. A tired reaper swinging too wide could injure the person next to them. Blood was a common sight. Cuts became infected within days. There were no antiseptics, No antibiotics, only rags and home remedies. Tetanus, or lockjaw, spread silently. First came stiffness in the jaw and neck, then spasms, then death. All from a simple nick in the skin, soaked in soil and sweat, and there was little room for weakness. A wounded reaper couldn't afford to stop. If you didn't reap, you didn't eat. Wages were pitiful, just enough for bread and shelter. Injuries meant hunger. Hunger meant death. So they wrapped their wounds, clenched their teeth, and kept cutting. Insects swarmed their faces. Dust clogged their lungs. Many developed chronic respiratory issues, breathing in pollen, mold, and dry soil for hours on end. Some went blind from constant sun exposure. Others developed crippling arthritis in their wrists, elbows, and backs before reaching middle age. A reaper's body aged twice as fast as their years. Children joined the fields early. By age 7 or 8, many were handed small sickles and expected to contribute. Their hands blistered and bled. They learned to ignore pain, to silence screams. It was a brutal education in survival, taught under the sun with no escape. Some lost fingers before adolescence. Others were crushed under wagons loaded with bundles of grain. And yet, despite their suffering, reapers were rarely respected. They were the lowest rung of the rural hierarchy, expendable, interchangeable, forgotten. When landlords counted their harvest, they didn't count the lives lost to gather it. When lords toasted their full granaries, they never raised a glass to the men and women who paid for it with their health and blood. Disease thrived in the harvest camps. Reapers often slept together in crowded barns or under open skies, sharing fleas, lice, and illness. Wounds festered, feet blistered and cracked, skin peeled from sunburn, then blistered again. And through it all, they kept working. Because the harvest didn't wait, and neither did hunger. In some places, reapers sang to keep rhythm, to distract from the agony. These songs were not joyful. They were chants of endurance, echoes of sorrow buried in melody. The fields absorbed their voices just as they absorbed their sweat and their blood. By the end of harvest season, many were permanently changed. Some returned home limping. Others never returned at all. Their families mourned quietly, knowing it could be any of them next year. The land gave food, but it took so much more. And yet, without them, civilization would have starved. The great cities, the kings and courts, the scholars and poets, they all depended on the grain gathered by bent backs and blistered hands. The reaper's suffering was woven into every loaf of bread, every barrel of beer, every sack of flour. But no statues stand in their honor. No churches bear their names. They were the backbone of a world that refused to look them in the eye. So next time you pass a field of golden wheat swaying in the breeze, think of the hands that once carved those stalks from the earth. Hands that trembled with exhaustion. Hands that bled. Hands that fed the world and paid the price in silence.